The party was meant to be a celebration. Months of planning had culminated in a house packed with laughter, music, and the scent of catered delights. It was our anniversary party, a double milestone as my wife, Clara, and my brother, Eric, were also toasting the success of a joint business venture. The smiles, the shared glances between them, I chalked it up to their shared achievement. I didn't know that night would plant the first seeds of doubt. Clara had always been the life of the party. Her laugh could fill a room, her energy magnetic. I admired her from afar as she wove through conversations, her wine glass never quite empty. Eric was his usual charming self, a master of captivating small groups with his stories. At one point, I found the two of them at the center of a lively group near the patio. She leaned in as Eric gestured animatedly, their laughter echoing above the crowd. As the host, I moved around, ensuring everyone had a drink, checking on the caterers, and exchanging polite nods with distant relatives. When I spotted Clara and Eric slipping out of the living room, I didn't think much of it. They had always shared a friendly bond. But when they didn't return for a while, a small knot tightened in my stomach. I decided to look for them. Upstairs, the master bedroom was dark, but the faint sound of voices drifted from behind the door to Eric's guest room. The laughter was muffled, but I recognized Clara's voice. My hand hovered over the doorknob, the moment frozen. Before I could act, the sound of approaching footsteps startled me, and I quickly moved back downstairs. They reappeared shortly after, their expressions neutral. "Where'd you disappear to?" I asked lightly, hoping to mask the unease in my voice. Clara smiled and squeezed my hand. "Just checking something for Eric," she said, and kissed my cheek. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but a lingering tension stayed with me. Something had shifted, though I didn't yet understand what. The days after the party were a whirlwind. Between work meetings and follow-ups with vendors, life carried on as usual, or so it seemed. Clara was her usual vivacious self, bustling around the house and planning the next social gathering. Yet, something subtle felt off. I first noticed it when she started texting more than usual. She'd always been one to have her phone at hand, but now it rarely left her side. She laughed at the screen, brushing it off as messages from her book club. "Must be a funny book," I quipped one evening, trying to keep the mood light. She smiled, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes. Guilt, perhaps? "Oh, you wouldn't get it. It's inside jokes between us girls." I didn't press. After all, trust was the bedrock of our marriage, or so I thought. Eric's presence became more frequent. He dropped by to discuss business, or so he claimed. Clara would offer him a drink, and they'd sit at the kitchen counter, their heads close together over a shared laugh. I chalked it up to their camaraderie from working together, but the knot in my stomach tightened. One evening, as I cleared dishes while they chatted, I caught a fragment of their conversation. "We can't let anyone know," Clara whispered. Eric laughed nervously. "Don't worry, I've got it handled." I stepped into the room, my arms loaded with plates. They both fell silent, glancing at me as though I'd interrupted a secret. "What's the big secret?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. Clara tilted her head with a wide smile. "It's just about his business. Something I promised not to spill." Eric nodded quickly, his grin too wide. "Yeah, nothing to worry about, bro." Their explanation seemed plausible, but my gut churned. A strange intuition whispered that there was more to this story than I was being told. That night, as Clara showered, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. It wasn't like me to snoop, but the temptation was unbearable. I glanced at the screen. A message from Eric. It read, "When can we talk again? Today was risky." My hand trembled as I set the phone back down, a storm of suspicion and betrayal brewing in my chest. After seeing Eric's message, I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Misinterpretation was easy, and paranoia wasn't something I wanted to bring into my marriage. Still, the words echoed in my mind like a mantra. Today was risky. Risky for what? The next morning, Clara was all smiles as she prepared breakfast, humming to herself. It was almost too perfect, like she was overcompensating. "Late-night texts from Eric, huh?" I said casually, gauging her reaction. Her knife paused mid-slice over an avocado. "Oh yeah. He wanted to run an idea by me. He's working on some project that's driving him crazy. Her tone was light, dismissive. She resumed slicing, but her hand moved quicker, as if to end the conversation. Doesn't he have business partners for that? I pressed, attempting to sound playful. She glanced up, her expression a little too calm. I guess he trusts me more. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. It was a masterstroke of deflection, and it left me wondering if I was imagining things. Still, the unease gnawed at me. Over the next few days, I started paying more attention, more than I cared to admit. It was during one of Eric's drop-ins that the tension between them became more palpable. They stood in the kitchen, their voices hushed but hurried. Clara touched his arm lightly as they spoke, a casual gesture, but one that lingered longer than seemed natural. I walked in, pretending I hadn't noticed. What's going on in here? They both straightened, Clara withdrawing her hand as though it had touched a hot stove. Eric was just telling me about his travel plans, she said quickly. Yeah, heading out of town for a few days, Eric added, his grin a bit too quick. Business conference in Chicago. Chicago, huh? I said, nodding. That's a great city. You going solo? His hesitation was fleeting but noticeable. Yeah, just me and some colleagues. The conversation veered into mundane topics, but my mind replayed the scene like a movie reel. Clara's subtle flinch, Eric's fleeting hesitation. It was as if their words were veils barely concealing the truth. That night, I started piecing things together. Clara's newfound attachment to her phone, Eric's frequent visits, and now this mysterious risk. My thoughts spiraled. Was this all in my head? Or was there something lurking beneath the surface? I didn't have proof, and asking outright felt like walking into a minefield. But one thing was clear. I couldn't ignore this any longer. The following week, I decided to test the waters. If Clara and Eric were hiding something, they wouldn't suspect me of noticing. At least not yet. I needed to observe, to gather information, to understand the shape of this thing before confronting it head-on. Eric's trip to Chicago provided the perfect opportunity. Clara seemed genuinely at ease during the days he was away. She even joked about how quiet the house felt without his random visits. It was the first time in weeks that I didn't feel the weight of suspicion pressing down on me. But the evening before Eric was due back, something shifted again. Clara seemed distracted, checking her phone more than usual. When I glanced over her shoulder during one of her hurried taps, I caught sight of his name in the notification banner. Is Eric back already? I asked, keeping my tone casual. No, just a quick check-in. He said the conference is going well, she replied, too quickly. She set her phone face down on the table, a move she'd never bothered with before. Her mood changed after that, more distant, as if a part of her mind was elsewhere. It only confirmed what I already suspected. Her connection to Eric ran deeper than she was willing to admit. That night, I decided to plant a small trap. Clara had an old habit of leaving her phone on the kitchen counter while she showered. I waited until the water was running, then slid my phone across the counter, pressing its camera lens to her screen. It only took seconds to snap a photo of her latest messages. I put everything back as it was and retreated to my office. The image was blurry, but one message from Eric stood out. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. I missed you more than you know. It was a punch to the gut, but it wasn't definitive proof of anything physical. Still, the tone was unmistakable, intimate, charged, and wildly inappropriate for a text between my wife and my brother. The next day, I decided to confront Eric indirectly. I called him under the guise of discussing a family matter, keeping my tone light. How's Chicago? I asked after the small talk. It's been good. A bit dry. You know how these conferences are. His voice was steady, but something about it felt rehearsed. And Clara? I heard she's been keeping tabs on you. There was a brief pause. Oh, yeah. She asked about a couple of work things. You know how she is. Always so helpful. Helpful. The words stuck in my throat like a thorn. Well, safe travels back, I said, ending the call before my anger could surface. The pieces were falling into place, but I needed more. The truth was out there, just beyond my grasp, and I couldn't rest until I had it. Eric's return from Chicago brought with it a palpable shift in the air. He came over for dinner the night after his arrival, a plan Clara had eagerly coordinated, much to my unease. Sitting at the table, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was dining with strangers. Clara was dressed to the nines, wearing the dress I had bought her for our anniversary last year. She laughed at Eric's jokes, her gaze lingering on him just a moment too long. Eric, meanwhile, was unusually reserved, as though his usual charm had been dialed down a notch. At one point, while Clara was in the kitchen refilling drinks, Eric leaned closer to me. "Thanks for having me over, man. It's good to see you." His tone was almost cautious. "Of course," I replied, keeping my face neutral. "Family always comes first." Eric flinched slightly at the word family, but he quickly recovered, offering a tight smile. Before I could press further, Clara returned, and the moment was gone. Later that evening, as we cleaned up, I decided to prod Clara. "You seem to light up when Eric's around," I said casually, wiping down the counter. She turned to me, startled. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," I replied with a shrug. "Just an observation. You two have been spending a lot of time together lately." Her eyes narrowed, but she quickly masked it with a laugh. "Don't be ridiculous. You know he's like a brother to me." The irony of her words stung. "Right?" I said, forcing a smile. "Like a brother." She didn't say anything else, but her mood turned frosty. That night, she went to bed early, leaving me alone with my thoughts and my suspicions. I decided it was time to dig deeper. Over the next few days, I became more methodical, paying closer attention to Clara's patterns. I noticed that her phone would buzz late at night, long after we'd gone to bed. She'd glance at it quickly, smile faintly, and then place it face down on her nightstand. The final straw came on a Thursday evening. I came home early from work to surprise Clara, only to find her on the phone in the backyard, her voice low and hurried. She hadn't noticed me yet, so I stayed hidden near the patio door. "I know it's risky, but we'll figure it out," she said. "He's been acting strange, though. I think he suspects something." My heart pounded as the pieces clicked into place. She ended the call abruptly, then turned to head back inside. I quickly moved to the living room, pretending to be engrossed in a book. When she walked in, her smile faltered for a split second. "You're home early," she said, her voice strained. "Thought I'd surprise you," I replied, keeping my tone light. "Who were you talking to?" Her eyes darted away. "Just a friend from the book club. We were planning our next meeting." I nodded slowly, feigning disinterest. "Sounds nice." Her relief was almost palpable, but I knew better. I had caught a glimpse of the storm brewing beneath her facade, and I wasn't going to let it pass unnoticed. The tension in the house grew thicker with every passing day. Clara tried to maintain her usual demeanor, but cracks were starting to show. Her explanations became overly rehearsed, her laughter a little too forced. I didn't press her, not yet. I was waiting for the right moment. Meanwhile, I needed evidence. Something tangible that would confirm my suspicions and give me clarity. That's when I remembered Clara's old tablet, which she rarely used. It was synced to her phone years ago, and I wondered if she had ever bothered to unlink it. One night, after Clara had gone to bed, I retrieved the tablet from the hall closet and powered it up. It was sluggish with age, but it still worked. My heart raced as I opened the messaging app, praying that it would still sync. To my surprise, it did. The first messages I saw were mundane exchanges with friends and family. But then, as I scrolled further, I found a thread marked with a single initial, E. My pulse quickened as I opened it. Most of the earlier messages were deleted, but a few recent ones remained. They were just cryptic enough to avoid detection, but unmistakably intimate. "Can't stop thinking about that night. Tomorrow, same time, same place. We need to be careful. He's starting to notice things." My chest tightened as I read the words. It wasn't just in my head. There was something going on, something more than just friendly banter. I took screenshots of the messages with my phone, careful to leave no trace on the tablet. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was enough to confirm my worst fears. The next day, I started to lay my groundwork. I called an old friend of mine, Ben, who worked in tech security. Without divulging too many details, I asked him for advice on tracking someone's phone activity discreetly. He hesitated at first, But when I explained that it was a matter of betrayal, he reluctantly agreed to help. "Look, I'm not condoning this," he said. "But if you're really sure, I can set up a way for you to monitor her location and messages remotely." "I need the truth," I replied. "I can't keep living like this." By the end of the day, Ben had walked me through the setup. It was simple enough. Nothing invasive, just enough to give me insight into her movements and communication patterns. That evening, Clara was unusually affectionate, as though sensing the growing distance between us. She suggested we have a date night, something we hadn't done in weeks. I agreed, playing along with her attempts to bridge the gap. Over dinner, she seemed genuinely engaged, her eyes lighting up as she talked about her plans for the weekend. For a brief moment, I wondered if I was overreacting. Maybe there was an innocent explanation for everything. But then her phone buzzed, and her demeanor shifted instantly. She glanced at the screen and quickly set it aside, her smile faltering. "Everything okay?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "Yeah, just a reminder about book club," she replied, her voice tight. The lie was so blatant it almost made me laugh. But instead, I nodded and sipped my drink, knowing that the truth was already starting to unravel. The weekend arrived with a strange quietness in the air. Clara had gone out early Saturday morning, claiming she needed to pick up supplies for her book club gathering. I watched from the window as she backed out of the driveway, her phone already pressed to her ear. I checked the tracker Ben had set up. Her location pinged not at the local market, but at a cafe across town, one I knew Eric frequented. My stomach churned as I stared at the blinking on the map. I waited, watching her location hover at the cafe for over an hour. Finally, it moved, this time to a nearby park. I grabbed my keys and decided to investigate. If they were meeting out in the open, it might be my chance to catch them in the act. When I arrived at the park, I kept my distance, scanning the area. And then I saw them. Clara and Eric were sitting on a bench near the edge of the lake, their heads close together. She was laughing, her hand resting on his knee. Eric looked around nervously, his posture stiff, but Clara seemed completely at ease. From afar, it could have been mistaken for an innocent moment, but I knew better. I took out my phone and snapped a few photos, my hands trembling with a mix of anger and heartbreak. It wasn't damning evidence, but it was enough to confirm what I already knew. They were hiding something. I drove home, my thoughts racing. The betrayal felt heavier now, the weight of it pressing against my chest. By the time Clara returned that afternoon, I had calmed myself enough to act normal. She breezed in with a bag of groceries, humming softly as if nothing had happened. "How was the book club prep?" I asked, feigning casual interest. "Exhausting," she replied with a dramatic sigh. "But I think we're ready for tomorrow." I nodded, not trusting myself to say more. As she busied herself in the kitchen, I retreated to my office and reviewed the photos I had taken. I also checked the tracker logs, noting every stop she had made that day. The timeline lined up perfectly with her lies. That evening, Eric called. His voice was strained, as though he were walking a tightrope. "Hey, just wanted to check in," he said. "Haven't seen you much lately." "Oh, I've been busy," I replied coolly, "though I hear you've been keeping Clara company." There was a long pause. "Yeah, we've been bouncing some business ideas around," he said finally. "She's got a sharp mind for strategy." "Good to know," I said, my tone neutral. "Maybe we should all get together soon. Catch up properly." He laughed nervously. "Yeah, maybe." The call ended shortly after, leaving me with a bitter taste in my mouth. Eric was rattled, which meant he was hiding something. I could feel the truth slipping closer, like a shadow just out of reach. I decided it was time to escalate. If they thought they could keep me in the dark, they were sorely mistaken. The stage was set, and I was ready to uncover the full extent of their betrayal. I didn't sleep that night. The photos, the messages, and the lies. They looped endlessly in my mind. By morning, I was done playing the waiting game. It was time to pull at the threads and see what unraveled. Clara left early again, claiming she had errands to run before her book club meeting. I watched her drive away, then opened the tracking app. As expected, her destination wasn't the bookstore she had mentioned. Instead, she parked at a small boutique hotel on the edge of town. This was it. I had no more patience for doubts or speculations. I grabbed my keys and followed. When I arrived at the hotel, I parked across the street, keeping my car out of sight. Clara's vehicle was in the lot, unmistakable with its personalized license plate. I waited, my pulse pounding in my ears. After a few minutes, Eric's car pulled in and parked beside hers. They didn't even attempt subtlety. Clara emerged from her car, her expression lighting up as Eric stepped out. He reached for her, and they embraced briefly before heading into the hotel lobby together. I stayed frozen in my car, my emotions swinging between rage and despair. It was all laid bare now. No more lies to shield me from the truth. For a moment, I thought about storming inside, confronting them on the spot. But I stopped myself. There was still more to uncover. Instead, I reached out to Ben again. I need to retrieve some deleted messages from Clara's phone, I told him. Whoa, Ben said, his tone cautious. That's serious. Are you sure you want to go down this road? I'm past the point of no return, Ben. I need everything. Ben sighed. All right, I'll send you the instructions. But be careful, this could backfire if she finds out. Later that day, I followed his steps, connecting Clara's phone to my computer while she was in the shower. Within minutes, I retrieved a cache of deleted messages and began scrolling through them. What I found turned my stomach. That night at the party was incredible. I can't stop thinking about it. He's too distracted to notice anything. We just have to be smart. I can't keep lying forever, Eric. I don't know how much longer I can do this. The messages painted a vivid picture, one that confirmed their betrayal had started months ago. The party, the laughter, the shared glances. It had all been the beginning of something I hadn't seen coming. I saved everything to a secure folder and locked her phone back in its usual spot. That night, as Clara sat beside me on the couch, scrolling through her Instagram feed, I wondered how she could act so normal after what she'd done. But then again, she didn't know that the mask had slipped. She didn't know that I had seen her for who she truly was. For the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of calm. The storm was building, and soon, it would be unleashed. But not yet. I needed to plan carefully. Revenge wasn't just about action. It was about precision. The next few days were a blur of planning and waiting. Clara carried on as if nothing had changed, blissfully unaware of the quiet tempest brewing beneath the surface. Meanwhile, I was meticulous in my preparations. If I was going to confront her, and Eric, I wanted to ensure there was no escape, no room for denial. I began planting seeds. Casual remarks dropped into conversations, subtle hints meant to put Clara on edge. So, what's the book club reading these days? I asked one evening as we sat down to dinner. She barely glanced up from her plate. Oh, the usual. A thriller this time. Something light? I nodded thoughtfully. Thrillers are fun. They always remind me how easy it is for secrets to unravel. Her fork paused midway to her mouth, but she quickly recovered. Exactly, she said with a forced laugh. That's what makes them so entertaining. Meanwhile, I enlisted the help of a private investigator, someone discreet and experienced in uncovering infidelity. I handed over the evidence I had collected so far. The photos, the messages, the tracker logs. I need definitive proof, I told him. Something irrefutable. He assured me he'd handle it and promised to update me within a week. As the days passed, I kept a close eye on Clara's movements. She was careful but not careful enough. The tracker showed her meeting Eric multiple times, always at secluded spots, always under the guise of errands or work obligations. Each new log was another nail in the coffin of our marriage. The investigator's report came back sooner than expected, and it was worse than I had imagined. Photos, timestamps, receipts. It was all there, laid out in meticulous detail. Their meetings, their hotel visits, even intimate moments captured through discreet surveillance. It was undeniable. But what truly set my blood boiling was the discovery of their shared plans. Hidden among Clara's messages were references to a potential future together. Phrases like, "Once the timing is right," and "when it's just us," made it clear they had discussed a life beyond their deception. That night, as Clara slept peacefully beside me, I stared at the ceiling, replaying the events in my mind. The betrayal wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment. It was premeditated, deliberate, and unrelenting. It was time. I had everything I needed to confront them, but I wasn't going to do it in a way they expected. No shouting, no dramatic declarations. My revenge would be quiet, calculated, and devastating. The opportunity to confront Clara and Eric arrived sooner than I anticipated, and it came in the most unexpected way. It was Clara's turn to host the book club at our house, an event she had prepared for with her usual meticulous attention to detail. She spent the day cleaning, arranging platters of snacks, and double-checking every corner of the living room. As the evening rolled in, a handful of women arrived, chatting and laughing as they settled in for their meeting. I excused myself, pretending to be occupied in my office, though I kept an ear tuned to the sounds of their gathering. My plan was simple. Let the night play out, and if Clara slipped away for another clandestine rendezvous, I'd follow. About an hour into the meeting, I heard Clara's voice rise above the others. "I'll grab the dessert," she said, excusing herself from the group. I heard her footsteps retreat into the kitchen, followed by a low murmur, barely audible, but enough to catch my attention. I stepped quietly into the hallway, moving toward the sound. Peering around the corner, I saw her standing near the pantry, her phone pressed to her ear. "I can't talk now," she whispered hurriedly. "He's home, and the girls are here. Tomorrow, same time?" There was a pause, followed by her sharp intake of breath. "Stop saying that. If he finds out, everything will fall apart." Her voice trembled with tension, and for a moment, I felt a pang of satisfaction. She was cracking under the pressure. As she hung up, she turned to head back to the living room, and I quickly retreated into the shadows, my heart racing. The next morning, I set my final plan into motion. Knowing Clara would meet Eric later in the day, I decided it was time to bring everything to light, but not in the way she would expect. While she was in the shower, I accessed her phone again and retrieved the messages that confirmed their meeting. I forwarded them to Eric with a single line attached: "We need to talk." Then, I reached out to Eric directly, bypassing Clara entirely. "Meet me at the cafe by 2 p.m., I texted. "No excuses." He responded within minutes. "What's going on?" "You'll find out," I replied. At exactly 2 p.m., I arrived at the cafe and spotted Eric at a corner table. He looked nervous, his fingers drumming against his coffee cup. I sat across from him, my expression calm despite the storm brewing inside me. "Thanks for coming," I said. "What's this about?" he asked, feigning ignorance. I slid a folder across the table, one containing every piece of evidence I had gathered. The photos, the messages, the investigator's report. He hesitated before opening it, but as he flipped through the contents, his face turned ashen. This isn't," he stammered, his usual composure unraveling. "Save it," I said coldly. "I'm not here to listen to your excuses. I already know everything." His eyes darted around the room, as though searching for an escape. "Look, it's not what it seems." "It's exactly what it seems," I interrupted. "You betrayed me, and you didn't even have the decency to hide it properly." He slumped back in his chair, defeated. "What do you want from me?" "I don't want anything from you, Eric," I said. "But you're going to tell Clara that I know. And you're going to end this, today." By the time I left the cafe, I felt a strange sense of control. The confrontation with Clara would come next, but for now, I had delivered the first blow. The rest of the pieces were about to fall into place. When I returned home, Clara was already back from her supposed errands. She greeted me with her usual smile, though I couldn't help but notice the tension in her eyes. Eric must have already called her, though she was doing her best to act normal. "Hey," she said casually. "How was your day?" "Eventful," I replied, matching her tone. "We need to talk." Her smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. "Sure. What's up?" I gestured toward the living room. "Let's sit." She hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding and following me. As we sat across from each other, I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I was about to do. "I know about you and Eric," I said simply. Her face drained of color. For a moment, she looked like she might deny it, but then her expression shifted, panic mixed with resignation. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling. I leaned forward, holding her gaze. "Don't insult me by pretending. I know everything." The messages, the meetings, the lies. I've known for weeks. Her lips parted as though to speak, but no words came out. Instead, tears welled in her eyes, and she buried her face in her hands. I never wanted to hurt you, she choked out. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Then how was it supposed to happen? I asked coldly. Were you planning to leave me for him? Or were you just hoping to keep this affair going until I figured it out? Clara shook her head, sobbing. It wasn't like that. I didn't know what I was doing. Spare me the excuses, I said, my voice firm. I've heard enough lies to last a lifetime. For a moment, the room was silent except for her muffled sobs. I let her sit with her guilt, watching as the weight of her actions sank in. I want you to leave, I said finally. Pack your things and go. Tonight. She looked up, her face streaked with tears. Please, don't do this, she begged. We can fix this. I'll end it with Eric, I swear. It's already ended, I said, standing. I saw to that myself. But there's no fixing this, Clara. You made your choice, and now you'll face the consequences. As I walked away, I felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, relief. But most of all, I felt free. The truth was out, and the burden of pretending was gone. I could finally begin to take back control of my life. The hours after Clara's departure were eerily quiet. She had packed hastily, her movements punctuated by stifled sobs as she threw her belongings into suitcases. I didn't offer to help or say much, just watched as the woman I thought I knew dismantled a part of our life together. Before leaving, she stood by the door, her face a mixture of shame and desperation. I'm sorry, she said softly. For everything. I didn't respond. What was there to say? Sorry didn't undo the betrayal. It didn't erase the lies. She lingered for a moment, as if hoping I'd offer some reprieve. But when I didn't, she turned and left, the door clicking shut behind her. That night, I opened a bottle of whiskey and sat on the couch, staring at the empty space where her favorite throw pillows used to be. My phone buzzed with a message from Eric. I know you hate me, and I deserve it. I just want to say I'm sorry. I laughed bitterly and deleted the message without replying. He had destroyed our bond, our family. For what? A fling? A fleeting moment of selfishness? I couldn't decide who I despised more, him for betraying me, or myself for not seeing it sooner. The next few days were a blur of logistics and emotional cleanup. I met with my lawyer, who assured me that the evidence I'd collected would streamline the divorce proceedings. Clara hadn't contested anything. It seemed even she knew there was no point. Meanwhile, Eric's silence was telling. I had expected him to try to smooth things over, to offer some grand explanation, but he stayed out of sight. Mutual friends and family began to reach out, having heard whispers of the fallout. I kept my responses vague, unwilling to broadcast the details just yet. It wasn't until a week later that I finally heard from Eric in person. He showed up at my office unannounced, looking disheveled and uneasy. I just need a few minutes, he said, standing in the doorway like a man awaiting execution. Against my better judgment, I let him in. He sat across from me, wringing his hands as he struggled to find the words. He began, then paused. I don't even know where to start. Try explaining why you thought sleeping with my wife was a good idea, I said coldly. He winced, as if the words physically hurt him. It wasn't about you. It just happened. That's a pathetic excuse, I snapped. You had a choice. Both of you did. I know, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. And I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But I didn't come here to make excuses. I came to tell you that I'm stepping back, completely. From the business, from everything. I'll transfer my shares to you. It's the least I can do. For a moment, I was stunned. Eric had always been ambitious, fiercely protective of his position in the company. To see him give it up so easily was unexpected. Good, I said finally. That's the first smart decision you've made in months. He nodded, standing as if the weight of his actions had aged him years. I'm sorry, he said again before leaving. His words didn't heal the wounds, but they were a start. The storm had passed, but the scars it left behind would take time to fade. Still, for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. hope that I could rebuild, even if it meant starting from scratch. Eric's decision to leave the business handed me an unexpected advantage. With his shares transferred to me, I now had full control, a reality I intended to wield as part of my quiet retaliation. I wasn't content to merely let the situation settle. Clara and Eric had dismantled the foundation of my life, and I wasn't going to let them walk away unscathed. I began by restructuring the company. Eric's departure left a leadership vacuum, and while I publicly cited personal reasons for his exit, I knew the rumors would spread. Behind the scenes, I reached out to our shared professional contacts, ensuring that Eric's name wasn't attached to any new ventures. It wasn't vindictive, it was strategic. He had betrayed me on a personal level, and I saw no reason to leave him a professional safety net. Meanwhile, Clara attempted to reach out multiple times. At first, it was through tearful voicemails and messages begging for forgiveness. When I didn't respond, her tone shifted. She began leaving angry messages, accusing me of being cold-hearted and refusing to see reason. One message stood out: "I made a mistake, but you're punishing me like I'm some kind of criminal. Eric doesn't deserve this, and neither do I." I played the message twice, marveling at the audacity. Did she truly believe that she deserved anything more than what she had brought upon herself? It was almost laughable. A week later, I received an invitation to an event hosted by a mutual acquaintance. One Clara and Eric were also likely to attend. I debated whether to go, but ultimately, I decided it was time to reclaim the narrative. I wasn't going to let them paint themselves as victims in this story. The night of the event, I arrived with a quiet confidence, greeting old friends and colleagues with a calm demeanor. It didn't take long for whispers to start. Clara was there, standing near the bar, her gaze darting toward me nervously. Eric was absent, a fact I took as a small victory. When Clara finally worked up the courage to approach me, she looked tired, her once vibrant energy replaced by hesitation. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the chatter around us. I gestured toward a quieter corner, though I knew this wasn't a conversation I intended to resolve. "What do you want, Clara?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She hesitated, wringing her hands. "I know I can't undo what I've done, but I need you to understand. I never stopped loving you." I laughed bitterly. "You have a strange way of showing it." Tears filled her eyes, but I felt nothing. "I don't want to lose everything," she whispered. "You already have," I replied. "And that's on you." Without waiting for a response, I walked away, leaving her standing alone amidst the crowd. I didn't look back. That night, I felt a sense of closure. Clara and Eric had both tried to salvage pieces of their lives, but I had ensured they would feel the weight of their actions. It wasn't about vengeance, it was about justice. After the event, things began to shift in my favor. My decision to confront Clara publicly, without malice but with clarity, marked a turning point. It was as though the act of laying everything bare had lifted an invisible weight from my shoulders. The whispers that followed were no longer about me as a wronged husband, but about my strength in standing firm. Eric, on the other hand, disappeared from the social and professional spheres. His resignation from the business and the subsequent restructuring had left him with few allies. Mutual acquaintances began to distance themselves, unwilling to associate with someone whose reputation was now marked by deceit. Clara, too, faded from the spotlight. Her attempts to garner sympathy fell flat when people learned the full story, thanks, in part, to the quiet but strategic sharing of evidence I had orchestrated. I didn't need to speak ill of her. The facts spoke for themselves. Meanwhile, I focused on rebuilding my life. The house, once filled with shared memories, felt hollow and suffocating. I decided to sell it, using the proceeds to move into a modern apartment in the city. The clean lines and open spaces felt like a fresh start, a place where I could redefine what home meant to me. Work became a sanctuary. With full control of the company, I threw myself into projects, revitalizing the business and expanding into new markets. The distraction was welcome, but it also served a deeper purpose, proving to myself that I could thrive, even after the chaos they had brought into my life. During this time, I began to reconnect with friends and family I had unintentionally distanced myself from during the ordeal. Conversations over dinner, spontaneous outings, and shared laughter reminded me of the support network I still had. A stark contrast to the isolation I'd felt in the months leading up to the confrontation. One evening, my best friend, Mark, came over with a bottle of whiskey and an offer to talk, or not. Sometimes, he said, pouring 2 glasses, it's just about remembering that the worst things in life don't define the rest of it. His words stuck with me. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself reflecting less on what had been lost and more on what I could build moving forward. Perhaps the most unexpected part of the healing process came in the form of forgiveness, not for Clara or Eric, but for myself. I stopped blaming myself for missing the signs or for trusting too deeply. I realized that their choices said far more about them than they ever did about me. I began journaling, a habit I had dismissed in the past as unnecessary. But putting pen to paper helped untangle the knot of emotions that had been tightening in my chest. Each entry became a small act of reclamation, a way to remind myself that my story was far from over. The revenge I had sought was not explosive or dramatic, but it was effective. Eric's fall from grace and Clara's ostracization were consequences of their own actions, amplified by my quiet resolve to ensure the truth was known. But more importantly, my focus on rebuilding allowed me to rise above the ashes they had left behind. Months passed, and the chaos that had consumed my life gradually faded into the background. The divorce was finalized without resistance, leaving me free to close the book on my marriage. Clara had moved to another city, according to mutual acquaintances, and Eric's departure from the business was complete. The storm they'd caused had dissipated, leaving a strange, still silence in its wake. But with that silence came clarity. One morning, as sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new apartment, I realized something profound. I wasn't angry anymore. The bitterness, the resentment, the desire for retribution, all of it had slowly melted away. In its place was a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. I decided to celebrate the occasion in my own quiet way. I went for a walk in the park, the same park where I had once witnessed Clara and Eric together. But this time, the memories didn't sting. They were just moments, pieces of a story that no longer defined me. As I sat on a bench, watching children chase each other across the grass, an older man nearby struck up a conversation. We talked about life, loss, and resilience. His easy demeanor a reminder of how far I had come. "You know," he said, smiling as he gestured to the children, "the thing about life is, no matter how many times it knocks you down, you always have a chance to stand up again." In the weeks that followed, I began exploring hobbies I'd once dismissed for lack of time. I joined a local photography club, traveled to a few places I'd always dreamed of visiting, and even started dating again. Tentatively, cautiously, but with a newfound sense of self-worth. One evening, I received a text from Mark. "Proud of you, man. You're not just surviving, you're living." He was right. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't looking back. I wasn't haunted by what I'd lost or consumed by what might have been. I was simply living. I didn't need Clara or Eric's apology or validation to move forward. The revenge I had sought had been exacted not through grand gestures or destruction, but by reclaiming my life, piece by piece. My success, my happiness, my peace of mind, they were the ultimate victory. As I stood on my balcony that night, gazing out at the city lights, I felt a quiet contentment settle over me. The past no longer held me captive. The future was mine to shape. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I smiled. Not because of what I had overcome, but because of what lay ahead.